So next we're going to talk about equity and how equity of a company is essentially a scarce asset, because as we know there's only 100% equity. It's not the producers. We can't sell 130% to 6 different people. So in the terms, there are 3 elements in particular that focus on equity as a scarce asset. In thinking about equity, we have to think about who has equity, who has possession of that asset, who might want access to that asset, who gets value from that asset. So obviously we do, because we're buying that asset. The founders have that asset. The ordinary shareholders have that asset. The employees will have some sort of access to that asset in most companies. And of course, later round investors. So when we think about this, we'll come back to this founder vesting concept. So basically what this says in the way it's being drafted is that at the time that we invest, 50% of the shares owned by the founders are subject to the buyback by the company if they leave the company under any terms, and in particular, if they act in any bad way. So if they're a bad actor or a bad leaver, then that triggers this, and under those circumstances, those shares can be purchased back by the company for $1. So it's intentionally a punitive approach. In an ordinary leaver scenario where it's just not right for that founder to be in the company anymore, family circumstances have changed, something of that nature, then there is a pricing formula built in by which the company would purchase back those shares at the minimum reasonable price. The idea is that we don't want the founders leaving the company with a large chunk of equity, and then we don't have that equity available to redeploy by selling it to new shareholders or by redeploying it to other members of staff or to other executives. So it's just about protecting that scarce asset for the benefit of the company and all the stakeholders in the company. So 50% in year 1, so at the time of signing, and for the first 12 months, 50% is at risk. At the end of year 1, half of that, 25%, is released, is vested. The remaining 25% then vests over the remaining 3 years on a monthly pro rata. So it's just an ordinary vesting schedule like you'd see for many other things you'd be familiar with. Now, in the angel investor consent area, talking about this issue, there is, if a company wants to issue new shares or equity, buy back shares or equity, or redistribute them in any other fashion, then that's something that we need to consent to. And that includes, as the question earlier highlighted, employee participation programs. So this is just about husbanding this very limited asset to be effective. So any questions about how we can treat equity as a scarce asset? Theo.
Thank you. How do we go about defining bad leaver or bad behaviour? Was it bad behaviour? Bad behaviour type scenarios. Bad actor.
Rowan, or Rory, do you want to respond to that?
Well, the main way that that's dealt with is in the founder buyback clause, in that it's usually a bad leaver is when they'll leave the company early. So it's really covered by that buyback clause, where if they leave in the first year, then you can buy back the 50% of their shares, and then that cascades down. There's also some other compulsory transfer events where, for example, if the shareholder is found to be fraudulent or in breach of the contract, then they'll be subject to a compulsory buyback or transfer of share regime. So they're the two main areas where those would be covered.
I guess the way to think about it from a principles approach is the wording has been structured not to try and list every single case, which has historically been the way some people have tried to do it, and you always leave something out. It's very difficult. The wording talks about broad behaviours because it's a breach of contract, and part of the contract is abide by the law. So if you do something illegal, you're caught, right? So the wording is designed to allow for a robust discussion about whether or not it's a bad action or a bad lever.
Just a follow-on question from that. It's defined as material breaches of the contract, so you're going to need to be able to demonstrate materiality. But in some circumstances, you'll have an exiting founder who doesn't breach, who may leave early, but then becomes a very disrupting influence once they have left. In other contracts, there are the abilities to unilaterally buy back within a certain period, say 3 years from the date of commencement. Until I've got up to 3 years to leave. They leave within that 3-year period, regardless of the vesting. You've got the ability to buy back under a formula. This contract doesn't approach it in this way.
No, it doesn't. It's again, it's about creating a compatible and palatable set of terms that align interests, deliver some protection, but are also acceptable to the other parties. So if you go to a founder and give them fairly strong terms, the chances are they're just not going to sign up to those terms, and other investors probably won't either, and later investors will certainly want to overturn those terms, and if they want to overturn those terms, they'll probably want to overturn all our terms. So part of our job is to come up with terms that are sufficiently reasonable to give us the provisions that we would like to have, but in a way that the founders will agree to, and that later investors will say, that was reasonable. I would have wanted that if I had invested, so I'm going to leave that in force. I'm not going to use the power of being the next round of investment to wipe out all of the terms of the previous round of investment. So it's a balancing act.
It's more related around the admin, but with the founder vesting. So they've vested their shares. So who's the notional beneficial owner? So you're dealing with ASIC. While they're vesting, who owns them? And then you got, after the end of year one, where they're vesting monthly. Be an absolute pain in the arse, to put it mildly.
I think the regime we've set up in the contract is in some ways the reverse of a vesting, because the shares are always held by the founder.
So it's still notionally held.
It's just that, well, they are legally held by the founder. It's just that they're subject to buyback. And we have to do it that way because the shares are held by the time the discussion comes to us to invest. And so it's designed to serve the same function as a vesting provision, but it's the opposite.
Like a call option.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's the opposite because they actually already hold the shares.
Roland?
And I'll just add one other thing there. The contract does have some flexibility around the shares can be either bought back by the company, which is the main way, but there's also some flexibility because a buyback does require certain approvals under the Corps Act, and as you may know, is sometimes a bit of a lengthy and administratively difficult process. So there's some flexibility if the buyback can't be done, that the company or the board can direct that instead of the shares being bought back, they have to be transferred to a nominee. Yeah. So, obviously a friendly person, you say, well, the shares get transferred to them rather than having to go down the buyback route if that's not going to work practically.
Roland?
With regard to the good leaver, bad leaver clause, should there be an employment contract put in place? What if you get a male founder that wants to fool around with female staff? What if you get a male or a female staff member that decides they want to go and work somewhere else part-time, and that's deemed to be a possible conflict of interest? There are a whole host of issues. And the other thing that hasn't been covered is a confidentiality clause to cover all staff that they should all enter into that lasts at least 3 years past their leaving date, should they be good leavers anyway.
Well, yeah. So we would normally expect that there would be employment contracts put in place, and that that is, that's mentioned in the documentation. I haven't mentioned it today because it doesn't specifically go to some of these issues. The problem is all of these terms working together. As you can see, they come up in multiple categories. That's why today we're trying to talk around the broad principles. But it's a very good point, and it certainly is covered.
Yeah, so just to add to that, Jordan, one of the conditions precedent is that the founders are supposed to enter into employment contracts that the Angels approve of, and then within the good leaver, bad leaver provision, there is a clause that says that their shares can be brought back if they materially breach their employment contract. So those sorts of situations you thought of would generally be covered by employment law and under their employment contract, and also confidentiality that would usually be covered in their employment contracts as well.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the next one.